In this video, we'll compare the qualities of vibrance and saturation between the raw phase and in Photoshop. So we're going to work with 8563. We have no adjustments made to it whatsoever. It is completely zeroed out. Let's send it over as it is as a smart object to Photoshop. So edit in, open as a smart object in Photoshop. And once we're inside Photoshop, we need to duplicate it. Make sure to right click, choose new smart object via copy, which is the appropriate way to make an independent copy. Let's call this raw edit on the bottom. On top, we'll put it into a group. Let's call the group PS edit, and it did not go in the group. So let's drag it into the group, make sure it's indented like that. And let's start by doing a comparison of vibrance between these. So go to create a new adjustment layer, choose vibrance, and make sure it's sitting right above our top copy. Within the vibrance, let's push it all the way up to the maximum. Just like in the raw edit, the maximum you can go to is plus 100 on vibrance, although of course in Photoshop, we could add multiple copies of this. So in Photoshop, we can technically go beyond this original edit, but let's just stick with the max here and see the differences. Let's hide this for the moment. And in the underlying version here, we'll double click into the smart object and slide the vibrance here all the way to plus 100. Now, of course, this is an extreme version. I would not push these colors so strong here, but I want to show the differences between the two and pushing them out to the limits without clipping. If we start to clip colors, it won't be a good comparison, but within limits, it's the best way to see the differences. Say OK. And now we can compare the two versions by simply turning on and off the Photoshop edit. And clearly, this is the raw, this is Photoshop. Adjusting vibrance within the raw is bringing out a lot more color, especially in these washed out areas here. So for example, we'll duplicate this one more time. This is our unadjusted layer. Create a new smart object via copy, drag it all the way to the bottom, and let's call it original. So let's compare these different options. So I'm going to put the raw edit on top here. So we can see we have the original, which has minimal color in the sky. Then Photoshop is able to extract a fair bit of color, but there's not as much here as you might want. And then using the raw version, we get to even more color, although the blues start to get a little bit punchy. But clearly the raw vibrance can go further than Photoshop. Now, what if we were to take the Photoshop version and add more? I'm going to hit Command J to duplicate that layer. So now we've done vibrance twice and compare that to the raw. So you can go further in Photoshop. What if we dial this down? It's too much. What if we take it to say like 50% or so and just see if we can get to a point where they're kind of comparable. And we can see that the nice yellows that we care about in the middle here are starting to match. But what's different are the blues, as well as this area of clouds over here. And to my eye, at this point, I still like the raw edit better. I think the blues are getting a little bit too kind of silly and punchy in the double vibrance version beneath. Let's get rid of this top vibrance layer and just zoom in a little bit more on these clouds, because there's another interesting thing that's going on here. You may not have noticed zoomed out. Look at the clouds. So now we have 100% vibrance in Photoshop versus 100 in RAW. And notice these cloud edges are much more colorful in the RAW. So overall, I would say that the RAW does a better job of bringing out weak colors with vibrance, and it also does a better job of keeping color in your brightest highlights. So my preference would be to edit vibrance in RAW. Let's get rid of these top layers and let's take a look now at saturation. So we'll create a couple copies of this, do a new smart object via copy. We'll call this our raw edit. We'll do another copy of the original. And let's put the original into a group, which we'll call PS edit. Drag it in there, make sure it's inside the group. And then we'll add a vibrant saturation layer. Notice if we go to hue saturation, you have a different saturation slider. It also goes to 100. It'll produce a different result. So let's do a couple different versions here. So this will be with the saturation slider to 100. Let's make sure we can see it here. Obviously that looks pretty rough. Let's create now a vibrance layer, and I've turned off that HSL layer, and let's slide this saturation up to 100. It's a very different result between these. In fact, I'm just going to duplicate this one more time. We'll make one for the HSL. So I'm just going to clean up these layers here. We'll call this PS saturation. So even though we have a vibrance layer, it's the saturation slider here. So we have on top here now, when we use 100 in HSL versus 100 in saturation, clearly very, very different algorithms. Let's zoom back and just look overall. You would never want to make this kind of adjustment. So 100 here is not an appropriate adjustment. Let's bring it back to something that is within the realm of reasonable. So maybe somewhere around 68 or something like that. Now in comparing these, you can see that the HSL just has a very different result than the underlying saturation. It is bringing out some pretty nice color in the sky. I think there's a lot of reasons you might like using that. So that's one option for Photoshop. And let's take a look at our raw here. So in the raw, let's go and boost the saturation to 100. And let's do this. Let's hide the HSL. So this and Photoshop are the most directly comparable. So we have our raw saturation versus Photoshop saturation. Not identical, but very, very close, to the point that I don't think there's much of a difference. Let's zoom in here and take a look at these clouds. And there are some differences, especially in the brightest parts of the clouds. The raw is still doing a slightly better job. Notice if we zoom way in here and look at that difference. There's almost a bit of a color clipping, depending on what you like. You may like the contrast that's coming out of Photoshop. It's not a right or wrong, but I think it's more accurate in the raw. So I would deem the raw and Photoshop versions of the equivalent saturation approach to be more or less the same for most of the edits that I do. However, clearly the HSL adjustment is very different. And notice that while it had some nice areas of color across the image in these clouds, it's not very realistic. It's pushing out the boundaries of the cloud and causing essentially a form of banding around the cloud here. So that's too much. If we dial that back down, let's see what we can get to here. I'm going to move this here. So at any point here, if you see a bad result when you push too high, at any point coming back, you're only going to get to the point where you remove clipping, and then beyond that, you're just minimizing the effect. So if we go here and we see clipping, it's not good. If we come back in until the clipping is gone, that's about the most you could punch up the global saturation on this layer without causing problems to this area. Let's zoom this back and see how these compare. So here we are with 33 HSL versus the saturation in RAW. So I think if you want a natural looking result, the raw saturation or the saturation slider in a vibrance layer in Photoshop are going to let you do that in the areas that are most saturated. If you have some areas here that are pretty weakly saturated, you could potentially use an HSL layer at an unnaturally high strength. So pushing this up will restore a lot of color here. Just know that areas that are already saturated are going to get blown out. So you'd have to mask this in. But when we compare these, you can push out more color here. And in a way, this is a bit like vibrance because we're bringing in saturation to the weakest areas. So this with a vibrance mask on it would be a safer way of bringing up this vibrance while keeping this down within Photoshop. Or we could take a look at how these approaches compare when looking at actual vibrance. So now we've got 100 vibrance on the raw, and let's take a look at how that compares to our HSL edit. And the saturation is, well, kind of debatable between the two because the blue looks nicer. So they're all just different, I guess, is the bottom line. I'm not going to declare one of these the winner. It's going to depend on how you want to edit your files. But the saturation slider in RAW, the saturation slider here in Photoshop, they're pretty close, and you wouldn't have to worry too much between the two of them. HSL, on the other hand, is a different animal. I tend to use HSL when I'm working on specific colors in Photoshop, or you could throw on a vibrance mask to be more controlled. But just know that it's easy to punch up the saturation too much and start causing problems in Photoshop. So if you do aggressively increase the saturation here, look out for things like these clouds, because you might not see those problems when you're zoomed farther back, but on closer inspection, you may find out that your saturated colors have really become problematic and blown out.